Can y'all see me? Okay. It's okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Hello, everyone here in the AADM Justice Center. My name is Denise. I'm the Athens Anti-Discrimination Movement's administrative assistant. And I'm really glad to be hosting this with the amazing people that we have as speakers today. You know, AADM does a lot of direct support for folks. We help people with bailout and legal fees. We help people out with community service. We work with the youth. The reason that this is so important for us to put on today and for us to put on for the next 8 weeks is because we can't leave tomorrow's children with the same issues that we're fighting today, right? The same issues that we're seeing today, we can't allow to continue on. And that starts with education. It starts with us understanding how we got in the positions that we're in. It starts with us figuring out all of the background information on that, understanding the issues as we're dealing with them now and how to move forward. So that's why I'm super excited for us to teach the truth. And I want to introduce Chaplain Cole, who has been working tirelessly to put all of this on. Chaplain Cole's going to talk a little bit about how all of this got started, and then introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Woo. All right, am I centered?
Yeah, you're good.
Can y'all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So hello, everyone. My name's Chaplain Cole Napper, and I am super excited to be here. Athens Anti-Discrimination Movement has been doing some amazing work here in Athens, Georgia, my hometown. And I mean, I'm in love with Athens Anti-Discrimination Movement. And I just want to take a moment to honor Mocha Jasmine Johnson, who couldn't be here tonight. We love you. We love you, Mocha. Thank you very much for starting this movement here in Athens and with all of the people who have helped you start the movement. Names that I don't even know. But what you've done is to start to bring justice and hope to people in a lot of different ways. So the Teach the Truth classes came about as a part of the Pledge to Teach the Truth rally that we had about a month ago at the site of Lemontown. And that was such a powerful rally. And what came out of that was a desire to keep that going, to let K through 16 teachers here in the state of Georgia in particular know that now is the time, more than ever, now is the time to teach the truth. As a Athens native, I went to Clark Central High School. I took advanced placement American history, and I never learned anything about Lemontown. Of course, I never learned anything about Juneteenth either, but hey, it's a national holiday now. So we know that change happens, and change happens whether or not we want it to. Change is going to happen. Change is going to come. And so what I'm proud of today and tonight is this inaugural event of 8 weeks. This is our first class. For the next 8 weeks, we will be delving into all sorts of issues that teachers need to know and need to be able to discuss in their classrooms, because our kids are asking. They want to know what their history is all about, and we need to be able to give them good answers. And if we can't do that, then we are failing them. And so there's so many people that we want to thank here, but in particular, we just want to get started. We want to get started with our very first, our inaugural class. It's being taught by an incredible individual. And I'm just going to grab my phone because I left it over here. Couldn't get through that. Okay. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Tianna Dowie-Chen. She is a former secondary school teacher from Ontario, Canada. She earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction, specializing in teachers, schools, and society from the University of Florida in 2021. In 2020, her dissertation work was recognized by the Association for Academic Women at the University of Florida with the Madeline Lockhart Dissertation Fellowship. She has developed a multi-pronged interdisciplinary research agenda that broadly examines race and education, with a particular focus on Black feminist thought and education, fostering critical race approaches to teacher education, and challenging global anti-Black racism in education through race theory. In the fall of 2021, she joined the University of Georgia as an assistant professor of social studies education. We are incredibly honored and proud to welcome our very first educator, Dr. Tianna Dowie-Chen.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if I'm as a dynamic speaker, but I'll try to follow in your footsteps. So thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I am also very glad to be here. It's a little bit nervous being the first, but the good thing about going first is you can sit back and relax after. And so I'm glad to be here with you all in person, and those of you on Zoom, thank you so much for spending time with us, even though it's virtually. So before I begin, one thing that I've asked those of you in the room to do, and those of you online, is to consider one question you have about critical race theory. So as Chaplain Cole shared, our students may be asking us about things, people may be asking us about critical race theory. It's a hot topic in the news right now. So I will delve in a little bit about that, but I'll also talk about CRT in the classroom. So critical race theory for short is CRT. That's usually what I'll call it today. At times I will use the long form critical race theory, but most of the time I'll use the acronym critical race theory. So I want you to think about that question. If you can, share it in the chat. I may have time at the end. I'm hoping to have time to address them. And I also want to know the questions. So hopefully throughout the course of Teach the Truth Thursdays, that we'll also be able to re-examine these questions, bring them up. And I'm also hopeful that some of these questions will be answered throughout the course of the presentation. So I'm going to begin, perfect, thank you, Denise. So I'm going to begin with this quote. You can press it. And this is a scenario of a school teacher. So you might find yourself in a similar position, but I'll share this quote from an article in Education Week. Tianna Dowie, a high school teacher in Oklahoma City, recently told NPR that she and her colleagues had planned to discuss a school-wide approach to help students understand current events, including the murder of George Floyd, family separation at the Mexico border, and the use of racist terms such as the China virus. Students want to have these important conversations, Dowie stated, but since the state enacted one of the nation's strictest bans on CRT in early May, she's unsure of how to proceed. So I start with this quote because I want to highlight this idea of teachers feeling restricted and feeling restricted in this moment where CRT is a hot topic and a hot conversation. So I want us to really take a look at what is CRT in the classroom. You have a number of media outlets such as NPR releasing information about CRT, but I present to you today an academic approach to CRT, and also as Chaplain Cole shared, I was a former high school teacher. So I also use that vantage point to share my perspective and hope that you'll bring your perspective to the conversation as well. So my question for you is this CRT? The question of discussing, or the idea of discussing George Floyd, the family separations at the Mexico border, or even discussing racist terms like the China virus, is this in fact critical race theory? So hopefully over the course of this discussion and class, you'll kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and I want us to really reflect on that question. So this is just an introduction, my name, information. So Teach the Truth Thursdays, I'm glad to be the first one to start us off. And I will be talking, as I said earlier, about critical race theory and classroom. And I'm specifically, when I use the term classroom today, talking about K through 12 classroom. I could have a whole other presentation about higher ed, but I will stick to K through 12 today. And again, my name is Tianna Dowie-Chin. If you'd like to email me, there's my email. I can also put it in the chat later if you need it. Thank you. So I'll outline our class today. We're going to start with a 6-word story. So I like to start with the activity that helps me get to know you and you get to know each other. So we're going to do a little bit of a warm-up activity. Then we're going to move on to why CRT and why now? So why is CRT a hot topic now? There's some reason that people are paying attention to it, that it's gaining media attention. And so we want to talk about that. Coupled with that, I'm going to explore the legislation related to critical race theory. So as the first quote shared, there's a number of states that are banning or restricting the use of critical race theory in the classroom. So I want us to be introduced to that. Then we're going to do an activity called Pause and Reflect. Then I'm going to move into defining what is critical race theory, and then we'll move into an activity that asks you to think about what is critical race theory. Thank you. So who am I? I start off by saying I am a granddaughter. And so while I come to you in this capacity of Dr. Dowie-Chin, I must first position myself as a granddaughter, daughter. That's very important to the work and who I am, is that I'm somebody's child. And so as I think about the students in your classroom or my classroom, I'm reminded that someone cares about me, someone cares that I get home at night, and then thinking about our education, someone cares how much I am included in spaces. Also, I'm a sister. I'm a sister to 4 siblings, 2 pictured here. And particularly I positioned this picture with me and my little brothers because that is important to me when I think about the education system. I began working as a high school teacher as my youngest brother entered high school. So that was a very interesting experience because he was identified with a number of learning disabilities. So I found myself becoming an educator, but also advocating for my brother in a system that I worked within. So I share that as a part of my identity. I'm also a former high school teacher I shared before. This is a picture of my high school ELA class. They were reenacting Romeo and Juliet from the future. One of my favorite pictures of my class, so I share that. And then the last picture is just really a photo in the capacity that I come with you today. But I want to remind you that I bring all these identities to the work that I do. And I would argue that we all bring these identities to the work that we do. And so I just want to forefront that as we begin and as we delve into these 6-word stories. So you can do the next one. Thank you. So what I'm going to challenge you to do, and you can share them if you like, is a 6-word story about your life. If you have the handout, it's a PDF, so it might be hard to write on virtually. But for those in the room, there is space to create your bio in 6 words. So as a good teacher, I'll try to exemplify that on the next slide. So I have a professional 6-word story. So my first one is teacher, educator, passionate about social justice. So this is one that, I'd use in a professional setting, which this is, but I also want to share a social one. And I call it the fun example. And so would also describe myself as a sofa dancing Canadian girl navigating Georgia. And so if you haven't heard of soca before, look it up. It's amazing Caribbean music that I just love. And I love dancing. So that's an important part of my identity. And since moving to the US, I've honed in on my Canadian identity, but I embrace this description as being a Canadian girl, and I'm okay with calling myself a girl, and navigating Georgia. And so I want you to take a couple minutes. On my watch, I'll give you 3 to 4 minutes to take some time to think about your 6-word story. If you are encouraged to share it in the chat, you can. I'll ask a few people in the room if they want to share them out loud, but absolutely no pressure to. Okay.
So they don't have to hear
Okay, so hopefully you had enough time, those of us in the room and those of us on Zoom, to think of your 6-word story. I see some great ones in the chat, so thank you for doing that. In the attempts of giving you a couple more seconds, I just wanna share what the handout is about that I shared in the chat. I'll share it again for the newcomers if you can't access it. And so on one side, it has references. So this is references that I'm using in the presentation. Some of them are easily accessible and some of them are academic papers. So please, if you can't find them through your Google search or whatever means you're looking for, you can let me know and I can send them to you, because they don't make them as readily accessible as I would like. And so without going into that too deeply, and then on the back side, you can wait to explore that. We'll explore that together. It's for an activity we'll do later. And so I've seen a number of people share their 6-word story in the chat. Is anybody willing to do it in the room? Or if somebody wants to do it on Zoom, you could do it orally as well, or verbally. Yes, Chaplain Cole.
You just want me to name it?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's gonna provide an echo if you don't mute that. Okay. Okay, so I have child, spouse, caretaker, activist, donor, friend. Yeah, those are mine.
Awesome. Time together today to focus on critical race theory. So why CRT and why now? So we'll first watch a video. So we have a couple videos that were explored together. And so we're gonna watch this video that talks about critical race theory bans that are currently in place or are on the way to being implemented. So we'll watch this video and then I'll talk a little bit about why CRT and why now.
Race has always been a hotbed of contention in the US. That has come to a head with the deaths of several African Americans at the hands of law enforcement in the past year, sparking mass nationwide and international protests. Schools now sit at the heart of a national debate on how America's racial history should be taught. What was supposed to be a typical school board meeting in Virginia's Loudoun County last week turned into chaos. Hundreds of parents accused the board of indoctrinating pupils with the notion that America is inherently racist and that critical race theory is being taught. The board denies that is part of the curriculum.
Critical race theory is anti-white and it's not American.
My youngest looks very white, so they would look at her and say, "You are an oppressor," probably not knowing that she's actually biracial.
Critical race theory is an academic concept used since the 70s to explain how institutions, legal systems, and public policies can enable racism. The core idea is that racism is a social creation, and that it is not a product of an individual bias or prejudice. It's recently become a hot topic, thanks to former US President Donald Trump issuing an executive order to attack it and restrict funds to programs that teach students about systemic racism.
By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen. Critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together.
This idea that if we don't talk about white privilege, if we don't talk about institutionalized racism, if we pretend it doesn't exist, then we can allow these systems that are very much in place, these legal systems, these economic systems, that are very much in place to perpetuate them through generation through generation.
The order has since been overturned by President Joe Biden, and while there's no evidence that it's taught in America's public schools, that hasn't stopped several states passing bills to ban it in classrooms. So far, 5 Republican states, Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, and Tennessee, have signed a law banning it. A further 22 states have proposed legislation, including Arizona, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Maine. If more states pass critical race theory bans to limit the teaching of concepts such as racial equity and white privilege, it remains to be seen just how it will affect America's recent reckoning over race. Adam Amunu, TRT World.
Okay, so there's a lot that this video explored. We're going to try to cover a few pieces, and I will share and be transparent that I would describe myself as a critical race theorist, but I will say that my knowledge and my coming to critical race theory came through graduate school, and it's something that I will cover today. And while I'm going to try to give some insight into critical race theory as defined academically and in scholarship, I've taken a course on critical race theory. So it's hard to then say that today we'll cover all things. And we're also trying to combine it with talking about it in the classroom. So I will say this is like critical race theory 101. But what I think is really important when we consider the video is that this video started with talking about the racial uprising of 2020. And so recently I listened to Kimberly Crenshaw, who's noted as one of the founding thinkers of critical race theory. And we'll talk about the founding thinkers a little bit later. And she was on a podcast by the ACLU. And she was talking about this question of why CRT and why now? And as a critical race theorist herself, one of the things that she submits is that oftentimes in moments of racial justice, so we can see racial justice as Derek Chauvin being convicted for the death of George Floyd, that after that, there tends to be a backlash. So a backlash against this type of movement and this type of progress, though we know that that is only one step forward, that there tends to be in history, when we think about this historically, this is not something new. So she says, as a critical race theory, even if you look at the civil rights movement, there tends to be moments like this in history. And so that this is nothing new, but that we need to connect these bands historically to this moment that we're having. And so I think the video did a great job of doing that. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about legislation specifically. So I want to cover legislation and then we'll talk about the classroom. So first, I'm gonna highlight some legislation that is banning or restricting the use of critical race theory in the US. So 8 states, Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, Arizona, and South Carolina have passed legislation. So these states have formally passed legislation. None of the states' bills that have been passed even actually mention the words critical race theory, however, explicitly for Idaho. So what may become clear throughout our time together is that critical race theory is kind of muddled in this legislation, and it's wrapped up in other words. And so this last bullet point gets to that point. The legislation mostly banned the discussion, training, and orientation that the US is inherently racist, as well as any discussions about conscious and unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, and oppression. And so these parameters also even extend beyond race, and we see in some states that they include gender and any discussion related to gender as well as race. And so here I wanted to highlight one Florida amendment rule. So Florida has not passed entire state legislation. However, there is an amendment to curriculum. And so it's a little bit hard to see because of the fine writing, but I will read what is underlined in part. And so instruction on the required topics must be factual and objective, and may not suppress or distort significant historical events such as Holocaust, slavery, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and contributions of women, African American, and Hispanic people to the country. Okay, and examples of theories that distort historical events and are inconsistent with state board approved standards include the denial or minimization of the Holocaust and teaching of critical race theory, meaning the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. Instruction may not utilize material from the 1619 Project. Okay, so here's similar to what we saw former President Trump talk about was he coupled critical race theory and the 1619 Project. So here you see in the Florida amendment, you see a similar connection. So here you see a connection between critical race theory and 1619 Project. Okay. So here's a map of 28 states to restrict education. And here you'll see not the word critical race theory used, but racism, bias, and the contribution of specific racial or ethnic groups in US history or related topics. Okay, so you can see that 28 states have this type of legislation. You can see a part of the country that is pretty covered. So these are states are indicated by orange. And in contrast, on the next slide, we have tracked efforts in 15 states to expand education on racism, bias, the contribution of specific racial or ethnic groups in US history or related topic. Okay, so what is really interesting, so being a graduate from University of Florida, while I was finishing up there, I was contacted by UCLA, who's actually expanding their work using critical race theory. So it's very interesting leaving a state where we have amendments like the ones that we saw earlier. And then there's states like California who are receiving funding from school boards. So UCLA was like, can you help us work on expanding critical race theory and talking about civics education and looking at racial bias? So we see a contrast. And so I just wanted to show you the two maps in relation to each other. So here we arrive at a moment for you to consider a question. So while I haven't delved into the foundations of critical race theory, and I will do that, I want you to imagine something and consider a question. So this is what I call a pause and reflect activity. So let's imagine that a teacher used this video as a resource in their 6th grade classroom, okay? So this is a video that I found by Scholastic. It's readily available on YouTube, so you can access it yourself. But based on your understanding of critical race theory, and that is wherever you're coming from with your understanding, no judgment, does this video demonstrate teaching critical race theory? And so I will leave it there and then we'll watch the video, not the entirety, probably like half, I think it's 6 minutes, but we're just gonna watch a snippet of it. So if you wanna watch it, the remainder, it's available on YouTube.
The Underground Railroad. Long ago, a secret group of heroes in our country helped people be free and safe. These people worked in the dark of night. They used codes and secret messages. They hid in secret places and wore disguises. Who were they? They were part of a system called the Underground Railroad. And they helped enslaved African Americans escape to freedom. For more than 200 years, the United States had a system called slavery. Legally, enslaved people were considered property. They were forced to work for no pay and were frequently punished and hurt. They were often sent away from their families. Despite this, enslaved people resisted. They fought back, ran away, and sought freedom. Some brave people helped these freedom seekers. They created a network of secret routes, passageways, meeting places, and safe houses to help people make it to freedom. This secret network became the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not really a railroad, and in most cases, it was not underground. Instead, it was a group of people working together to help enslaved African Americans travel to northern states and Canada, where they would be safe and free. In the 1800s, slavery was legal in a number of southern states, but in other northern states, it was against the law. If an enslaved person made it to one of those states, they would be free from a life plagued by the horrors of slavery in the South. It wasn't an easy journey. The road to freedom was filled with danger. Many freedom seekers traveled great distances at night on foot. They traveled through pouring rain, icy rivers, and deep snow with little food. They had no protection from people hired to capture them and drag them back into slavery. Enslavers often hung up posters announcing the disappearance of freedom seekers. Enslavers offered large rewards to those who reported their whereabouts or returned them to slavery. Because of this, it was really important for the freedom seekers to stay hidden. The Underground Railroad helped with this. It offered safe spaces to rest, hide, and take shelter. One of the most famous people in the Underground Railroad was Harry.
Okay, so if you can and would like to, I would like for some people to share in the chat box if anybody wants to share here. But just to have you again think about this question. Based on your understanding of critical race theory, does this video demonstrate critical race theory? And you can take this from two lenses. One lens that you can take it from is based on the legislation that you've seen. And one could also be based on truth, but that's how I would describe it. But one could be based on a theoretical perspective. So critical race theory as you've maybe known it as theory, and then based on legislation. So either one would do. So I'll give you a few moments just to think about that and share it in the chat if you are able to or like to.
So we're just answering that question, right?
Yes, so just answering this question, based on your understanding of critical race theory, does this video demonstrate teaching critical race theory? So in our scenario of a teacher utilizing this video in their 6th grade classroom. Anybody in the room want to share their thoughts? Yes.
How you doing? My name is Naheem.
Hi, Naheem.
I watched the video and it shows a piece of American history. From my understanding of critical race theory, it is centered around how institutions have been shaped by racism being baked into it and the study thereof. So I don't know if I would necessarily consider the video critical race theory. Now, and I would say that the video represents what those who would like to sanitize their history, they represent it as critical race theory because they don't want to, have the mirror put up in their face. But from my understanding of critical race theory, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's what I just said.
Thank you. I appreciate that summary, and I would say A+. If we're thinking about this as being a class, that 101, you're already 103. But breaking it down in two parts of what you said. So just reiterating, as you first stated, the ideas of critical race theory, right? Thinking about a part of the history of this country and making that, speaking truth to that, sharing that. And part of that, of course, is the enslavement of African people, which this video showed, and also the Underground Railroad and the horrors of that. So not necessarily that this video exemplifies critical race theory, but the thinking behind critical race theory could be connected to this video. And then you also coupled it by saying those who try to position critical race theory in a certain light, that don't want to see themselves or see the country's history, might then point to this video and say, this video or the ideas that could be coupled with a teacher are then showing critical race theory. And so I appreciate both of those perspectives, because utilizing what you said, one thing that I will say here is as we engage together, it's not as clear as people may position it to be. To think about, what does critical race theory look like in the classroom? So before we delve into that, I'm going to go into what exactly is critical race theory. And so again, this is 101. It's going to be fast and quick, but from where I was entered into critical race theory, it has been positioned as an academic theory that is over 40 years old. So as the video stated, and as I also include here, it began in the 1970s and 1980s. Critical race theory also emanates from legal studies. So critical legal studies is actually the origins of critical race theory. Some foundational scholars that you'll hear about are Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Rachel Delgado. This is not extensive, but it began from critical legal scholars of color questioning legal systems, questioning law as not being as colorblind as it had been positioned. So there was a conference in the 90s where a number of critical scholars of color got together and said, we need to examine law through the lens of race and racism. And so what would it mean for us to take a look at the law from a different vantage point and centering race and racism? So the academic understanding very much differs from public discourse on critical race theory. And as a person who is in the academic field, but also hopes to be connected to public discourse and classrooms, I understand how that can become muddled, and it can also become inaccessible, because even as I list the references I have for you here today, some of the articles, you can't access them unless you have an institution that allows you or pays for the subscription for you to access these articles. And so I also say that not critiquing the public, but being transparent about the fact that my academic training allowed me to delve into critical race theory in a way that when I was a high school teacher, I didn't even know what critical race theory was, okay? So critical race theory is applied to different fields. The next slide, I'll talk about education, but education and public health are some places that critical race theory has been applied, but it's been applied in a number of fields. Thank you, Denise. And so Crt and Education. So it was introduced by educational scholars Goya Ladson-Billings and William Tate. Ladson-Billings is my, I would just say, somebody that I look up to. I definitely fangirl when I think about Ladson-Billings. But her and William Tate, they introduced critical race theory into the fields of education. So they utilized critical race theory to examine the education system. So when we think about disproportional discipline or academic achievement, they question what would it mean to then utilize critical race theory to examine the things that are going on in schools, in classrooms at a systemic level. I really appreciated this quote from the Education Week article. Critical race theory in education looks at how policies and practices in K-12 education contribute to persistent racial inequalities in education and advocate for ways to change them. And so I highlighted the idea of policies and practices. And so when I think about the public discourse on critical race theory, there's a lot about individual people's character, evil, wrongdoing, but critical race theory has, as I have read scholarship by Latson Billings and William Tate really focuses on policies and practices, not on people's hearts and the condition of their being. And so I really want to highlight this idea of policies and practices. And then I also want to, which I didn't include here, is that within the public discourse, there is a big division of Black and white. And when I think about critical race theory, they use oftentimes the terms people of color. And without going in depth today, there are offshoots of critical race theory like Lat Crt and even Black Crt that are specific to communities of color, or tribal Crit that look at Indigenous people and their experiences with racism. And so I want to highlight that also even the positioning of critical race theory as Black versus white is definitely positioning this binary that doesn't really include other people of color. And so there are a list of tenets, and the way that you can think about tenets are some supporting underlying thoughts about or points about critical race theory. I'll try to go over them pretty fast, but I could spend a day talking about each one. The first two are commonly discussed, and I would say are ones that are fairly used in maybe media if critical race theory is discussed. And the first one is racism as normal part of American society. And so some of the other ways that this has been used in critical race theory is racism as being ordinary, as being a common part of American society. And so some have challenged this idea of America being inherently racist. However, critical race theorists would position the foundation of American society as built on racist ideals. Secondly, race is a social construct. So this idea that we are biologically a particular race or that this is a natural part of society, critical race theorists push back on that. Although at the same time, while recognizing it's a social construct, they say there's very material and real consequences. So while it is a social construct, it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences or things that happen because, for example, I'm a Black woman. So even though that's a social construct that I am seen and positioned as a Black woman, there's really real material consequences or material things that happen because I am seen through race. The third tenet is it centers people of color through storytelling. Probably one of my favorite tenets, if tenets could have favorite, I don't know. But this idea of centering people of color in the storytelling, particularly when we think about history. So oftentimes we know that history is told by the victor, supposedly. And so what would it mean to position people of color to tell their own stories and their own experiences? So when we think about American enslavement, what would it mean for descendants of enslaved people to then tell that story? And so critical race theorists examine and consider what would it mean, and they do it in practice of centering people of color. And then lastly, this idea of interest convergence, probably one of the more complicated tenets, but in simple terms, it's the idea that oftentimes racial progress is not does not take place because it's morally beneficial to all people, but that there's usually some reason why it happens, whether that be economic or some other political reason, but that oftentimes when these movements are made, and for example, they critique the civil rights movement for one being a moment of interest convergence, well, although it definitely benefited people of color in many ways, they critique it for not being wholeheartedly benevolent or beneficial to people of color. Okay. So that was a really fast and quick version of critical race theory, so what it is. So I'm going to go over a little bit about critical race theory, what it is not. So this title is completely taken from Latson Billings. It's the name of her article, but I thought I would play on it today to highlight a few points about critical race theory. So critical race theory is not commonly used as an approach in teaching in teacher education programs. So I know I have teachers in the room, I know I have teachers online. I went through a teacher education program. I did not read anything about critical race theory. If you have in the chat, please raise your hand. If you did in your teacher ed program, I already have a job, but maybe I could reference someone else to go there because I have not use it at least as a teaching practice. So maybe in a theoretical space, I might have been introduced to it, but not in a teaching practice. Also, it's not commonly taught in K through 12 classrooms. And what I mean by that is critical race theory is not introduced like, today we're going to study critical race theory. Today we're going to study Ladson Billings, we're going to study William Tate. I haven't seen that, haven't yet to see that, but that is what has been projected in the media. And so in contrast, so critical race theory is typically used in higher education as a theoretical perspective. So in law programs across the country, as an example, there's oftentimes critical race theory courses, as well as education programs will have critical race theory courses. And so that is more commonly practiced than K through 12 classrooms. I don't want to say it never happens, but it definitely is rarer than being common. And then so the last myth or thing about critical race theory that I want to debunk today, it does not focus on individual white people or name them as evil. And so I think that's really important because that is something that I've seen throughout the media and continue to be reiterated, that there is this focus on white people as being inherently evil or having some sort of characteristic that critical race theory hones in on. So in my scholarship and through the research that I've done, I have not seen this explicit language used or even the focusing on white people as individuals. As I reiterated before, CRT does in fact focus on practices and policies. And so it focuses on systems. And so this idea of systems and centering voices of people of color, even within Ladson Billings' article, Critical Race Theory, What It Is Not, she even critiques that the idea of sharing people's voices of color shouldn't just be this idea that we share our experiences to complain, but that we share them so that we can highlight systemic issues. So again, coming back to this idea of troubling systems, pushing systems, even transforming, changing systems. So less focus on the individual and more focus on systems. And so now we're going to talk about CRT in the classroom. And so we're going to do an activity in a moment, but I want you to think about the idea of, is it culturally relevant teaching or is it critical race theory? Maybe and. And so I just have pictures of books here that I think some of you may be familiar with. If not, they are books that may be utilized in classrooms that center people of color. This one is Hair Love, Netflix, not Netflix. I think the Oscars, it won an Oscar, the mini movie. It's really great if you haven't seen it. Mango, Abuela and Me. And so this is a story that centers a Latinx family who belongs here. So this idea talking about, or this book talking about immigration or immigration status, so who belongs in America. And then the last one is called The Hero in the Helmet, about Colin Kaepernick. So I introduced these just to have you start thinking about, how do we distinguish between culturally relevant teaching or critical race theory? And so I'll give a little summary about culturally relevant teaching in the next slide. Thank you. And so again, culturally relevant teaching, can go on about it, can take a course in it. So, but I will try to just introduce it very quickly for the purpose of our activity that we'll be doing. So I would like to introduce this concept because there is this idea that oftentimes what is said to be critical race theory can also be a form of culturally relevant teaching. And how do we as teachers think about that, or even legislators think about the difference? So Gloria Ladson-Billings also developed this concept of culturally relevant pedagogy in education. So to summarize it in 3 points, the first one is student learning, the student's intellectual growth and moral development, but also their ability to problem solve and reason. So this idea that students can be critically engaged and that we should develop their critical consciousness. Secondly, cultural competence, skills that support students to affirm and appreciate their culture of origin while developing fluency in at least one other culture. So what would it mean then to honor students' cultures if we have students that come from different cultures, that have different immigration statuses, that also have different identities than what is positioned as the norm? And then lastly, critical consciousness, sorry, a mix of student learning, the ability to identify, analyze, and solve real world problems, especially those that result in societal inequalities. So culturally relevant teaching positions teachers to think about, how do we develop and support students to think about real world problems and to see themselves as change agents? So what would it mean to then fight against certain injustices, racial injustice as an example? And so I share this with you because we'll go into an activity in a moment that I will have you think about. Is this critical race theory, or is this culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy? So pedagogy and teaching in this presentation, I'll use them interchangeably for the sake of this presentation. And so before we go into our activity, I want to share this quote again from Education Week. Critical race theory is not a synonym for culturally relevant teaching, which emerged in the 1990s. This teaching approach seeks to affirm students' ethnic and racial backgrounds and is intellectually rigorous, but it's related in that one of the aims is to help students identify and critique the causes of social inequity in their own lives. So I will leave that quote there. We'll probably come back to it at the end of our time together, but we're going to move into an activity that I will describe. Okay, so I'm not going to make groups, but on the back of your handout, I have two scenarios. Because I think we have enough time, I would like you to read each scenario, and then I'll describe what you are to do. So individually, read and think about your classroom scenario. Then decide whether you believe the scenario constitutes critical race theory, culturally relevant teaching, both, or neither. And then some kind of reasoning. So I'll read the scenarios. Anyone has any questions, I'll answer them, and then I'll give you some time to think about it. So I purposely did not give you a lot of detail because I wanted you to think about the media sharing these scenarios. So oftentimes you only get a tidbit of what is said in the classroom. So scenario one, for her political science high school class, Tianna Dowie-Chin, who we got introduced to earlier, has planned a unit around prison reform and included a lesson related to incarceration rates amongst different racial groups, with plans to have the students watch and analyze the Netflix documentary 13. So you can look it up if you're not familiar with it. And then the second scenario is Drew Morgan wanted to update her third grade classroom library to reflect the demographics of their student. They recently noted the growing number of students who were of Mexican descent and was excited about two books she purchased. Ariely is a Dreamer, a true story by Ariela Morales, a DACA recipient, and Undocumented, a worker's fight. Okay. And so these are two books that she purchased and was excited to share. And so these are two different age groups, third grade and high school. And I want you to consider that question. Is this critical race theory, culturally relevant teaching? Both, neither. It's kind of muddled, but I want you to think about that and provide a rationale. And so I will give you until 6:30, not 6:30, so 8 minutes. So if you need to take a bathroom break or anything like that, you can definitely do that. And then we'll come back together and hopefully discuss this. Okay, I appreciate the lively discussion in the chat, and Montu, this is for you, and I appreciate conversation, and I always see it as a fruitful discussion. So originator, foundational thinker, I don't want to misspeak, but Derek Bell is certainly, some people call it founding father. We've kind of moved away from that language, but thinking about critical race theory that way, I do see Kimberly Crenshaw as a foundational thinker, being that she coined the term interest conversions. So thinking about her work related to that, I did name her and have seen her named as a foundational thinker in relation to critical race theory. But I think there's room for discussion about that. I did enter one of her earlier pieces related to race and racism and the law in the chat. And so that's just one thing. She's done a lot of work related to Anita Hill and thinking about that moment in history and how that exemplified intersectionality. Sorry, I should have been saying intersectionality this whole time. So intersectionality. So thinking about intersections of race and gender in particular. So my apologies, intersectionality is the term that I wanted to use. And I didn't go through intersectionality today, not because it isn't important, but because this was just a 101. So hopefully you've had some time to think about the two scenarios that I provided to you. And so I had an opportunity to review the chat, and I saw someone saying about the video we watched earlier that this is just teaching what happened in history. And so I would see that Underground Railroad video in a similar light, but I'd love to hear how you're thinking about these two scenarios. And so those of you in the Zoom chat, you can feel free to come off mute, or you can put it into the chat box if you're comfortable. And so for the first scenario, with Talania Nofar, teaching about prison reform and potentially teaching the Netflix documentary 13. Does anyone want to share whether or not they thought this is culturally relevant teaching or critical race theory, and then some rationale? I'll also take a look at my laptop just to see if whatever's coming up in the chat. Anybody in the room want to talk through any of their thoughts about this particular scenario? Okay.
Can they hear me on that, or do I need to come up with mute to say it?
Can anyone let us know if they can hear Chaplain Cole?
Yeah. All right. So I just believe that it is. It's not whether you decide whether you believe the scenario constitutes critical race theory and cultural teaching, both or neither. I say that they are both critical race theory as well as culturally relevant pedagogy. I believe that they are both. And the reason that I believe that they are both is because, well, in the first scenario, prison reform and incarceration are tying things directly to our history. And those are all things that are relevant to our students. So I believe that it is both pedagogy as well as critical race theory. That's fine.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then, pointing out those terms of prison reform and incarceration rates and things like that, thinking about those systems. And so unless anybody else in the Zoom wants to share, I'll move on to scenario number 2. So I'll give some moments if anybody in the group wants to share their thoughts on scenario number 2. So this teacher having certain books now in their classroom. Okay, and Beth says, by examining the 13th Amendment and those systems, we can see how racism is embedded into law and institutions. Yeah.
Good answer.
And then so the second scenario with Morgan, Miss Morgan, with these 2 books, any thoughts about whether this is culturally relevant pedagogy or teaching or critical race theory?
Yeah.
I'm leaning towards culturally relevant teaching, or even neither, depending on how you want to look at it, because I feel like it's introducing the concept of culture, but it doesn't sound like she's actually making any connections. Like we were saying was important with critical race theory. But then seeing that she's just adding it to the library, I know it's available to the students, but to me, that makes me question whether they're even actually getting these lessons and are exposed to the culture.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And so for those of you who may not have heard, some of the things that she shared was the fact that this could be culturally relevant pedagogy or teaching, but maybe not even, because the teacher's introducing these books to their library, but that doesn't mean that they're doing anything about teaching about culture or integrating it in any other meaningful way other than having these books on the shelves. So we don't really know what's going on within the classroom practice. Okay, so unless there's any other comments, we'll move on, and we're getting towards the end. So I just have images for each scenario, but I will leave you with this quote and then a challenge for you to share any questions you might have. But before I do that, I want to just think through these scenarios and offer some conversation in my thinking. So thinking about both scenarios, I think what's important to think about this idea of critical race theory as having these foundational tenets, and how these foundational tenets can often be applied to a number of scenarios or situations, for example, like the one in the first scenario. But I would submit that I could easily be this teacher in scenario one when I was teaching high school political science, but have absolutely no idea what critical race theory was. And so how do we then distinguish what are motivations for teachers teaching? How could we then connect it to this theory that, to me, does highlight systemic issues or a system of racism that this scenario number one is highlighting, but this teacher may or may not have ever even come across critical race theory. And so that is one thing that I am having to grapple with and thinking about as we think about legislation related to critical race theory. We could say that this teacher maybe is going to have a conversation about prison reform and incarceration statistics and talk about systems and connect it to critical race theory. But there's nothing here that indicates that this teacher will make any explicit connection to critical race theory. And so while I do agree that there's some connections to tenets related to critical race theory, it's not explicitly clear whether this teacher is utilizing critical race theory as a way of thinking or even introducing the students to critical race theory. And then for the second piece, building off of what was shared, is that some people might see this introduction of books such as Undocumented as somehow introducing concepts into a third grade classroom that's inappropriate, that teaches a side or a perspective in history that highlights America in a way that's unfavorable or unsavory. And so that should be removed. But is this critical race theory? I would submit that it isn't. Again, for similar reasons. We don't know what the teacher's doing with these books. It's unclear how they're going to be utilized. And even it's unclear, is this culturally relevant teaching? So Lots of Buildings talks about critical consciousness. So this idea of affecting and enacting change because of systemic issues. And so while a student can read this book Undocumented, what is the teacher doing to have the students grapple with conversations related to immigration? And so these scenarios are purposely muddled and unclear because I want to highlight the fact that it is not clear that critical race theory is at all being used in K through 12 classrooms. However, scenarios like the two that we went over today have been positioned and utilized to say that critical race theory is being taught. And so hopefully these scenarios and our conversation today has you thinking about what does critical race theory actually look like in practice versus what are we thinking about in terms of the theoretical tradition that is critical race theory. And so this quote is bringing these ideas home. So while some district officials have issued mission statements, resolution, or spoken about changes in their policies using some of the discourse of CRT, it's not clear to what degree educators are explicitly teaching the concepts, or even using curriculum materials or other methods that implicitly draw on them. For one thing, scholars say much scholarship on CRT is written in academic language or published in journals not easily accessible through K-12 educators. Now, I want to highlight this fact again, that there isn't clear evidence that CRT is widely used in K-12 classrooms. Now, if you were to ask me, should CRT be used and how CRT should be used, that may be a different conversation. I'm not trying to submit that CRT should not be used, but I want to also just highlight the fact that while these bans are widespread, there actually isn't very much evidence that it's being used in K-12 classrooms. And so that is really important because the conversation makes it seem as if it is. If we think about the video at the beginning, to me is a little disturbing when there was a parent that said, you know, my child is biracial but looks white. And so what if somebody comes up and says, you're an oppressor? And I was mortified because if I was a teacher, I wouldn't want that in my class, regardless of if a student was in fact 100% white. And so I think that this idea and this hysteria around critical race theory needs to be critiqued and pushed back upon. And that's what I hope to highlight today, that what is being positioned as clear and transparent CRT in the classroom really is not. And this conversation is quite muddled. And then so for the last slide, I believe, of our time together, I would love to hear one thing that you gained from the session. And even if you have another question that you want to share, I'd love for you to do that in the Zoom chat. I'll also put my email address in the Zoom chat so you can ask me further questions. I love further discussion. One of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou is that I know that I've learned that I still have a lot to learn. And so as a lifelong learner and educator, I'm open to discussions and questions. So if you have questions that you want me to address now, I can definitely do that, or to email them to you, we can definitely do that. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for those on Zoom. I don't know if we're gonna close out in any way, but thank you so much for your time.
So I'm just gonna ask if people have questions, because I know some people on the Zoom probably have questions. So at this time, if you're on the Zoom call and you have questions, please go ahead and ask them. If you have questions for Dr. Dowie-Chen, now is the time to either come off of mute or to put them into the chat. And I know that the folks in here have a question or two. So I am going to open it up. Jim, you got anything? See, yeah. That's what I do to my students too. What? No, but if you, yeah. And I'm just gonna let you stand back up here. Okay.
Dr. Dowie-Chen, I'll start. I always have questions. Thanks for calling on.
Yeah, no problem, Jim. I'm sure you'll pay me back.
When you talk about critical race theory as a teaching practice, like what would you say? Like, if people were teaching with critical race theory in a 10th grade civics class, for instance, what are some things that you would see?
So I would say, honestly, that I do not believe that critical race theory is a teaching practice. And so I think it's a theoretical perspective that you could bring to your teaching practice. And so if somebody was bringing critical race theory to their teaching practice, then they would do something similar to this scenario in number 1, for example, where positioning Michelle Alexander's 13th and talking about prison reform. But then, so that would be one way of centering people of color. But there have to be further discussions incorporated, thinking about systems and looking at the judicial system, looking at incarceration rates. So there would be so many other components related to it. So I think of it as a way that somebody can approach their teaching in terms of their thinking, but I wouldn't say that there's specific practices. And I think that's why I struggle. And so when I hear that people say critical race theory is being practiced, even as a scholar of critical race theory, I'm like, how do you do that? Because I would love to know how to do that. Because the way that I've approached it is a theory that we use in scholarly research. And it can be, and it has been muddled in public discourse, and I understand why, but I would say it'd be hard to pinpoint exactly, and I'm not sure that it can be done, but if it was done, that would be some ways. Thank you for the question.
Okay, awesome. Are there any other questions that are showing up in the chat?
No, I don't think so.
I'll leave it up to you. Do you want to close out now?
Oh,
good for you.
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
Yep.
I'll hand it
Yeah,
over.
as you can see, this is our inaugural event, so we're not as smooth as we think we are in our heads, but next week is going to be amazing. So first of all, we just want to thank everyone who you all could be anywhere. You all that came out here tonight, you could be anywhere, but you chose to be here with us, and we are so incredibly thankful. And so we look forward to not only what this night means for us, which is the beginning of the truth movement, right? Like something really powerful is happening here. And so it's going to continue next week when we're going to have Dr. Jim Garrett, University of Georgia professor, who is going to be here, who's going to be teaching difficult, challenging topics in the classroom. Help me out, Jim.
Difficult knowledge.
Difficult knowledge.
Yeah.
Difficult knowledge. What's the full title? Do you remember?
Pedagogies and difficult knowledge.
Pedagogies and difficult knowledge. Dr. Jim Garrett is going to be here. He's here tonight in person, and we are so happy that he is here. And he is going to be here next week to impart even more knowledge to us. So we look forward to and welcome you to come out. We'll be putting out all of the information on social media, and hopefully you all will continue to join us. Tell everyone that you know that this is going on, that this is happening. Knowledge is here, and it is so incredibly powerful. To Dr. Tianna Dowie-Chen, did I pronounce it correctly?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Whew. Getting it right in my head. Thank you so much, Dr. Dowie-Chen. We are incredibly blessed to have you here, to have you kick off this wonderful night for us. And we are incredibly thankful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And thank you to the Athens Anti-Discrimination Movement and our wonderful interns who helped us out. Thank you so much. Thank you to Beth Mendenhall, Dr. Jim Garrett, DJ, great to see you. Thank you, Denise, for all of your hard work. And we really just appreciate it all. And do you have anything that you'd like to say? Okay. If that's it, then we're gonna, anybody else? Hearing none, seeing none. Thank you. Have a great night. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Thank you. All right.